At 9:12 in the morning, a convoy of dark, unmarked vehicles turned onto a quiet street where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. Not in that neighborhood, not outside that neat brick house with trimmed hedges and pale curtains, and definitely not at the front door of the Queen Consort's sister. But that morning, the knock came hard and official. Not a neighbor, not a reporter, not palace staff trying to smooth something over. A high court enforcement team stood on the step with sealed papers, a recovery order, and exactly 37 minutes to enter, secure one item, document it, and leave. That item was not money. It was not a letter. It was a brooch. And not just any brooch. A sapphire and diamond state jewel worth more than £24 million, missing from the Crown's protected collection. Let's talk about what really happened, because this story was never just about jewelry. It was about power. It was about timing. And it was about the moment one side of the royal house realized the old rules were over. Today we are diving into a story palace watchers still whisper about in private, the kind of story that sounds too sharp, too exact, too cold to be made up. Journalists who track royal finance had been watching strange movements for weeks. Society insiders had been hearing that something inside the household had gone badly wrong. Staff gossip had started to turn from nervous chatter into that quieter kind of fear, the kind people get when they know a machine has started moving and nobody can stop it. Because what many people don't know is that royal battles rarely begin in public. They begin in silence. They begin in folders no one is meant to see. In calls that last 9 minutes, in cars that leave side gates instead of front entrances, and in documents carried by hand because no one trusts the internal channels anymore. And in this case, nearly everything turned on one glittering object called the Snowflake Jubilee Brooch. It had been commissioned years earlier to honor a late queen. The piece was extraordinary. 48 deep blue sapphires, more than 400 white diamonds, a design built to look like frozen light. It was not simply expensive, it was symbolic. It had been presented as a diplomatic gift, which meant it did not belong to a wife, a sister, or a cousin. It belonged to the institution. That distinction sounds dry until you understand what it means. If something belongs to the institution, you cannot slip it into private hands and call it a family matter. And yet that is exactly what insiders say happened. Accounts from journalists and former staff describe a chaotic restructuring period inside the royal estates, a time when archives were being shifted, catalogs updated, storerooms cleared, and objects moved across residences under heavy security. It was the perfect kind of chaos. Too much movement, too many lists, too many people assuming someone else had already checked the paperwork. Somewhere in that confusion, the brooch vanished. Not loudly, quietly, no alarm in the papers, no announcement, no dramatic search, just an empty velvet space in a secure tray where a national treasure had once rested. That is where many are questioning how the story first split in two. The first version was the polite one, a clerical issue, a delay in transfer, a box misfiled, the kind of harmless palace explanation that usually buys time and keeps tempers down. The second version was much darker. That version said the brooch had not been misplaced at all. It had been removed, taken out during the confusion by someone who had no constitutional role, no formal authority, and no right to touch the collection in the first place. And that someone, according to whispers that spread fast through court circles, was the Queen Consort's own sister. Now pause there, because this is where the story starts to feel unreal. The royal collection is not a costume cupboard. These are controlled holdings with records, image files, condition reports, transfer logs, and chain of custody rules that would make museum lawyers smile. You do not just wander in, lift something worth millions, and walk out unless something inside the system has failed, or someone inside the system has helped. That question hung over everything. Was this sloppiness on a catastrophic scale, or protection? On this particular occasion, palace insiders say the answer mattered less than the danger. Because either explanation meant the same thing, the shield around the institution had cracked, and there was one person almost guaranteed to notice. The Princess Royal had a reputation that made even senior aides sit straighter. She was not dramatic in public. She did not leak feelings to the press. She did not make speeches about loyalty and values. She worked. Read the file. Check the line. Ask the question again. Then asked it a third time if your first answer smelled wrong. So when an independent review of state holdings quietly began, few people outside the inner circle paid attention. They should have. Because that review was not a tidy stock take. It was a forensic audit. That meant old records were pulled. Historic provenance papers were matched against current lists. Transfer forms were reread. Exhibition notes were cross-checked. The kind of paper trail no one thinks about until it starts pointing in one direction. And this one did. Straight at a private residence. Straight at a family member who should never have been anywhere near the jewel. Straight toward a crisis no one could bury if the wrong person decided to treat it as law instead of family business. But there's more to this story. Because the missing brooch was only the first problem. The second problem was panic. Accounts from insiders reveal that once the audit trail began to tighten, certain people inside the Queen Consort circle stopped acting like people who believed a mistake could be fixed quietly. They started acting like people trying to outrun a legal fact. There were late-night meetings, draft papers, frantic conversations about status, ownership, immunity, and whether a personal signature from the sovereign could make an impossible thing look valid after the fact. That was the real miscalculation, not the taking, the cover. Because once you start creating paperwork after the event, you are no longer proving innocence. You are admitting fear. And somewhere between the whispered legal language and the palace corridors full of nervous faces, another call was made. A call that lasted exactly 9 minutes. A call that would change the whole shape of the story. By the end of it, this was no longer a royal disagreement. It was an operation. And the people planning it were not interested in negotiation. To understand why this exploded the way it did, you have to understand the old palace culture first. For years, the monarchy survived by mastering one art better than almost anyone else: containment. Embarrassment was softened. Scandal was delayed. Problems were moved sideways until the public grew tired or the press found something fresher to chase. That did not mean there were no fights inside the walls. There were always fights. Rival offices, hurt feelings, old jealousy. Quiet wars carried out through access, titles, invitations, and who got the better seat at a state dinner. But the public version usually stayed polished. The family line came first. The institution line came first. And if someone important behaved badly, the goal was almost never justice. It was management. What many people don't know is that this system worked because everybody understood the trade. You protect the house, and the house protects you. Not perfectly, not kindly, but enough. That is why the brooch affair became so dangerous so quickly. Because one side still believed the old trade existed. The other side had already moved on. Royal watchers had noticed the shift long before this crisis broke open. The Prince of Wales had been building something that looked less like a traditional court and more like a disciplined executive office. He was younger than many of the old hands around him, but far less sentimental. Former aides described a man who did not enjoy disorder, who liked structures that could outlast personalities, and who had very little patience for informal arrangements disguised as tradition. Unlike older generations, he seemed less interested in preserving royal habits simply because they were old. He wanted systems. He wanted clean lines. He wanted fewer gray areas where family ties could blur legal ownership. That mattered, because the Queen Consort circle came from a different instinct entirely. Their power had always depended on access, proximity, soft influence, the kind of control that lives in private rooms and informal understandings. Nothing written too plainly, nothing structured so tightly that it could not be bent later. These stories provide insight into why both camps were almost built to collide. And the warning signs had been there for some time. There had been tensions over archives before. Questions about which items were ceremonial, which were personal, and which existed in that murky royal zone that only lawyers and curators pretend to fully understand. There had been muttering among staff about objects being requested through unofficial channels. There had been small complaints, then denials, then silence. Not proof, but pattern. Then came the broader reorganization of the estates, and with it, the perfect storm. Thousands of objects were being shifted, restored, or recatalogued. People were overworked. Security teams were rotating. Paper trails were lagging behind physical movement. The whole machine was under pressure. Insiders later said that if someone had wanted to hide one removal inside a mountain of legitimate transfers, that would have been the moment. Many are questioning how no one slammed on the brakes sooner. The answer may be simple. In old institutions, people often ignore what feels awkward until it becomes undeniable. No one wants to accuse the wrong person. No one wants to start a war over a suspicion. And no one wants to be the junior official who says, "Excuse me, but has anyone checked whether a diplomatic jewel is sitting in someone's drawing room?" So the silence stretched. Then came another shift in the balance. The king's health became a private concern with public consequences. Recoveries, treatments, reduced availability. More reliance on those physically closest to him. That kind of vulnerability changes how power moves around a household. Not always in dramatic ways. Sometimes it happens through paperwork, through who gets the meeting, through who places a folder at the right moment and says, softly, "This only needs your signature." That is where accounts from insiders become especially troubling. They describe a moment when protective documents were prepared in advance. The idea, they say, was simple in theory and explosive in practice. Reclassify the missing jewel as a personal gift, then use sovereign approval to shield the private holder from legal consequence. Turn a disputed removal into a protected transfer. Change the label, and perhaps the whole story changes with it. Except it doesn't. Not if someone is still reading the original record. And not if someone refuses to play by the old rules. That someone was the Princess Royal. People who have worked around her often say the same thing in different words. She does not frighten easily. She does not panic. And she does not confuse family discomfort with institutional duty. If an item belonged to the crown and trust, then to her mind, it belonged there regardless of whose feelings were hurt by that conclusion. So when the audit surfaced the discrepancy, it did not stay vague for long. The paperwork was pulled together. The provenance was checked. The chain of possession was traced. And suddenly the case no longer looked like gossip. It looked documented. One palace source later described the feeling as a change in air pressure. One moment, it was still possible to imagine a quiet fix. The next moment, people understood that certain files had moved beyond the reach of persuasion. Then came the call. At 8:43 in the morning, the Princess Royal contacted the Prince of Wales. It lasted 9 minutes. No one outside that conversation knows every word, but insiders agree on the result. Whatever choices had still been open before that call narrowed fast afterward. Because on that particular occasion, she did not ask for a family meeting. She did not suggest a compromise. She did not recommend patience. She delivered the problem in legal terms. A state asset had been wrongfully removed. A retrospective shield was being attempted. Normal palace channels might be compromised, and if action was delayed, the institution itself would look weak. That changed everything. The Prince of Wales did not respond like a son trying to keep peace at Christmas lunch. He responded like an executive facing an internal breach. That was the moment the story stopped being about who loved whom, who resented whom, or who felt owed. It became about control of assets, independence of funding, and whether the next reign would inherit a blurred system or a locked one. Then came the most telling detail of all. The evidence was not emailed. It was not sent through aides. It was carried by hand. That choice says more than any dramatic quote could. It says trust had collapsed. It says someone believed digital or internal channels were no longer safe. And it says what happened next had been made possible by years of small tensions that finally hardened into one brutal conclusion. The family model was over. The enforcement model had begun. On that particular occasion, the crisis did not explode with shouting. It exploded with precision. The evidence arrived in person. A dossier thick with records, old inventory sheets, authentication files, transfer gaps, and the audit trail that tied the missing brooch to a private address. According to those briefed on the mood that morning, the Prince of Wales went through the material without drama. No scene, no emotional display, just the kind of stillness that makes everyone else in the room uneasy. Because when calm appears at the center of a scandal, it usually means decisions are already forming. And they were. What happened next shocked everyone involved, not because it was loud, but because it was so clean. The case was removed from the usual palace machinery almost immediately. No courtesy consultation with the Queen Consort's office. No attempt to settle the matter through household channels. No effort to preserve appearances first and ask questions later. Instead, legal specialists were brought in through independent funding. That detail mattered more than many people realized at the time. The prince was not relying on the ordinary royal purse, where influence might be delayed, diluted, or quietly redirected. He had access to a separate financial engine, one outside the emotional web of household politics. That meant he could move fast, hire who he wanted, and do it without asking the very system under suspicion to approve the response. Society insiders report that this was the moment panic truly set in on the other side. Because a family dispute can be softened, a legal operation cannot. And once the legal team framed the matter as recovery of state property rather than a private misunderstanding, the entire landscape changed. Mediation became weakness. Delay became risk. Softness became complicity. Every hour now favored whoever already held the jewel, so speed became the weapon. Then came the structural move no one had expected. The prince authorized the creation of a new independent trust for key royal heirlooms associated with the late queen's legacy. Lawyers worked quickly. Charity rules were used. The framework was designed with one purpose: remove vulnerable assets from informal royal reach and place them inside a regulated structure that no spouse, in-law, or shifting palace faction could easily influence. It was brilliant. It was cold. And it made the protective paperwork being pushed elsewhere look suddenly ridiculous. Because once the heirlooms were formally placed inside a trust, arguments about personal possession lost their force. The jewel at the center of the storm was no longer floating in some blurred area where someone could pretend confusion. It belonged to a protected legal structure. That meant a personal directive, even one blessed in private, could not simply erase the chain of public ownership. In one move, the attempted cover collapsed. Now the stage was set for the morning everyone still talks about. At 9:12 a.m., the enforcement team arrived. Witnesses later described dark vehicles, efficient movement, no wasted words, no uniforms designed for theater, no crowd management because there was no crowd yet. Just official men and women moving with the flat focus of people executing a court order, not joining a scandal. Inside the house, sources say the atmosphere turned strange almost at once. Surprise first, then disbelief. Then that hot, brittle anger people get when they suddenly realize they are not in a conversation anymore. They are inside a consequence. The order gave the team a narrow mandate and a strict timeline. Secure the item, verify condition, log recovery, remove it. That was all. And that is exactly what they did. 37 minutes. Think about that. Less time than a school run. Less time than it takes most people to answer a pile of emails. In those 37 minutes, one of the boldest private grabs in palace gossip was reduced to evidence in a recovery action. No negotiation, no special treatment, no last-minute call from a title-bearing relative to make it all disappear. Just procedure. Accounts from journalists and insiders reveal that the physical recovery was only half the blow. The other half came immediately after, when the usual royal public relations machine was effectively frozen. The palace press office did not rush out soothing language. No vague statement about an internal review, no promise of family unity, no attempt to recast the operation as routine. Silence. That silence was devastating. Because without palace spin, the legal reality stood there naked. A court-backed team had recovered a state jewel from the home of the Queen Consort's sister. The institution had acted against one of its own extensions, and nobody inside the system was trying to blur what it meant. But there's more to this story. Because just when the recovery had already landed like a blow, a second image finished the job. Later that same day, during a major public engagement, the Princess of Wales appeared in formal dress. Cameras flashed. Commentators talked about diplomacy, elegance, symbolism, and pinned to her outfit, plain for the world to see, was the recovered snowflake jubilee brooch. No statement came with it. That was the point. The visual said everything. The jewel had not only been recovered, it had been restored to sanctioned use, public meaning, and the direct future of the line. People in the room did not need a briefing. Foreign diplomats did not need a memo. Fashion editors did not need a press release. Everyone understood. The future had claimed the object, and done it in public. Many are questioning whether that was necessary. Was it justice? Was it humiliation? Was it a message aimed at one woman, one faction, or the whole old palace order? Maybe all three. Because imagine watching that from inside the royal maze. Imagine understanding every hidden move behind the image while the public simply sees sparkle. Imagine knowing the brooch once sat in a private house and now shines under state cameras on the chest of the woman most likely to wear the crown next. That is not just recovery, that is choreography. The fallout spread fast. Lawyers circled. Staff chose sides without announcing it. Some called the operation overdue. Others thought it ruthless beyond reason. A few said the institution had saved itself. A few said it had crossed a line from monarchy into something colder, harsher, almost corporate in spirit. And sitting behind all of it was the hardest truth of the crisis. Nobody could go back. Once a court order is executed against a royal relative circle, the old family magic is broken. The spell that says blood protects blood starts to fail. The household no longer looks like a sheltered private world. It looks like an institution willing to make examples. The full truth was still to come, because the raid had recovered the jewel. But it also revealed who now held the real power. The complete picture that emerged in the days that followed was even more unsettling than the raid itself. This was not a sudden outburst. It was a planned dismantling. Accounts from witnesses reveal a sequence so exact it felt almost military. The 9-minute call at 8:43. The hand-delivered file. The rapid legal framing. The use of independent funds. The trust structure finalized before the protective directive could matter. The enforcement team at the door by 9:12. The Brooke back in sanctioned public use before the day had fully cooled. Nothing about that chain feels accidental. What many people don't know is that power often becomes clearest not when someone raises their voice, but when they no longer need to. That is what this crisis showed. The Prince of Wales did not need to publicly attack anyone. He did not need a dramatic speech about values and duty. He built a mechanism, funded it, activated it, and let it speak for him. That is why this story unnerved so many palace observers. The old monarchy ran on feeling as much as law. Memory, softness, delay, layer upon layer of personal relationships cushioning hard outcomes. This new version looked different, more modern, more disciplined, more dangerous to anyone who mistook access for ownership. And the Queen Consort's position, after all this, became strangely hollow. Formally, she remained where she was. The title stayed. The appearances continued. The ceremonial life did not collapse. But insiders say something deeper had changed. Influence is not always measured by rank. Sometimes it is measured by whether your calls are returned, whether your preferences travel through the building, whether your family is treated as protected ground. After the Brooch affair, that protected ground appeared to vanish. Her sister, once merely a difficult name in an awkward whisper network, now stood exposed as a civilian with no special shield. The attempted paperwork no longer looked like a clever solution. It looked desperate. Worse, it looked like proof that somebody knew the original possession could not survive daylight. That is where public reaction split. Some people loved the severity of it. They saw accountability at last. They saw a future king, refusing to let the institution rot behind velvet curtains. They saw rule of law applied where privilege would once have won. For those people, the image of the recovered brooch worn publicly was not cruel. It was cleansing. Others saw something far more chilling. They saw a family war dressed in legal language. They saw humiliation turned into strategy. They saw a monarchy learning how to win modern battles by using compliance, asset structures, and public optics with almost corporate efficiency. To them, the operation proved strength, yes, but not warmth, and warmth has always mattered to the crown. These stories provide insight into a bigger problem royal houses never fully solve. People do not just want order from a monarchy. They want enchantment. They want continuity. They want human feeling to exist alongside ceremonial steel. If the institution becomes too cold, it may keep its assets and lose something harder to measure. That question now hangs over everything. Did this operation save the monarchy from internal decay, or did it teach the public to see the monarchy as a machine? Because once you notice the machine, you cannot fully unsee it. Accounts from journalists and insiders also suggest the crisis closed more than one door. The new trust structure did not just block one family branch. It created a model for the future, a way to wall off legacy objects, force cleaner lines of control, and limit what spouses or extended relatives could ever touch again. In plain terms, it was less a temporary fix than a blueprint, and blueprints outlive people. That may be the most important truth in the whole affair. The Brook was the symbol, but the real fight was over architecture. Who controls the physical memory of the crown? Who gets to define what is personal and what is national? Who can still operate in the blurry space between affection and entitlement? After this, that blurry space got much smaller. There is also the human side, and it is impossible to ignore. Imagine living inside rooms where every smile now carries history. Imagine appearing together in public after one side has dismantled the other's private defenses. Imagine family lunches, ceremonial processions, church services, balcony moments, all still outwardly graceful, all inwardly marked by something that cannot be publicly named. That kind of fracture does not heal because a schedule says it should. It hardens. Many are questioning how future generations will read this episode, as necessary discipline, as a palace purge, as the moment the heir stopped waiting and started ruling in everything but name. Probably all of the above. Because the final lesson of this story is not really about a brooch, it is about transition. The old world believed quiet compromise kept the monarchy alive. The new world seems to believe survival comes from clean systems, hard boundaries, and letting even blood relations feel the consequences if they cross them. That is a dramatic change in royal instinct. And it leaves one final image that is hard to forget. A quiet street. A sharp knock. 37 minutes. Then a flash of sapphires under official lights, as if the institution itself had reached out, taken back what was always its own, and worn the victory without saying a word. In the end, that may be why this story lingers. Not because it is loud, because it is precise. Because it shows how power looks when it stops pretending to be sentimental. Because it reminds us that behind crowns, carriages, and balcony waves, there is always a colder structure underneath one built from paper, law, timing, and people willing to act before anyone else understands the game has changed. These stories provide insight into how privilege works, how institutions protect themselves, and how family feeling can vanish the moment property, legitimacy, and succession collide. And once that happens, the glitter is never just glitter again.